So I'd asked you the other day if there were certain themes from our previous conversation that you wanted to hear more about, that you wanted to think more about. And of course, we started telling a mythological story that's quite a long story, and we just told one piece of it. And so I thought that we would indeed continue to explore that story by going further in the narrative. But I wanted to see the way that as we move forward, the story can further illuminate some of the themes that that we've already been looking into. And one of the things that you said you wanted to hear more about was this idea of kind of two approaches to spirituality. One that we associated with the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, and that we also associated with following the death instinct, which is the sort of ancient Greek version of an aponic force. And then on the other hand, an approach to spirituality that follows kama or eros, right? Which is more perhaps associated with a tantricized yoga. And indeed, these Puranic stories that we're telling seem to be presenting an approach to spirituality of the second kind. And so I thought one thing that I would do is bring that out a little bit more and maybe say what some of the sort of key distinctions are between these two approaches, in part because I think that the second approach you'll probably find far more compelling and attractive as an idea of yoga that you might see yourself as participating in. Whereas the first idea, your participation in it might be more sort of questionable. Another thing that you asked me to talk about was the way that energy moves through the body. Let's say ordinarily on the one hand, and on the other hand, the way that it might move in a body that was more steeped in yoga, let's say, more receptive, more attuned to the way that energy wants to move anyway, and what that has to do with this other spiritual approach, this sort of second approach to yoga. Does that sound like a reasonable, worthy? Okay, then. Okay. So, as you know, the yoga of Patanjali, the classical yoga, sort of starts with the idea that a certain suffering pervades ordinary experience, and that it takes discernment or insight in order to see that that's the case. So that if you haven't already, if that doesn't already sort of resonate with you, then it's unlikely that hearing the words of a particular philosophy are going to awaken that insight. It's usually something that you come to by reflecting on your own experience. And it usually takes the form of realizing that wherever you go, you bring with you a certain voice that's always narrating all of your experience and always assessing everything that you do, everything that you think, everything that you say, to see how well you're measuring up to certain standards that you impose upon yourself, right? And you also find, usually through reflection and, maturation, that voice, that voice sort of cramps your inner space. And indeed, the term that Patanjali uses for suffering is dukkham, which can be literally translated as bad space. And that sort of literal rendering of the term is really illustrative, because usually your sort of subjective experience, when this first insight into your sort of confinement starts to blossom, is a sense that your inner space is cramped, that energy can't flow through it, that maybe even in extremes, that there's not enough room within you to breathe, right? Because there's this imposing presence that you bring with you wherever you go. And it's not that, and what's imposing is not the negative assessment that you keep delivering of yourself, although you might, but you might also sometimes be delivering a very positive assessment of yourself, right? And yet you come to realize that even then, your space is quite cramped, quite sort of, occupied, as if something even that you might see more clearly is being occluded or eclipsed by the presence of this assessing voice. So it isn't, in other words, the fact that you give a negative assessment of yourself that leads to bad space, which is, of course, what you probably think it is in the beginning when you're younger, say, and you keep sort of feeling this underlying sense of anxiety, say, about who you're becoming, and you keep projecting that anxiety outward onto external affairs, or projecting that feeling outward on your ideas about yourself in such a way that you're motivated to continuously try to improve, to continuously try to rearrange your life so that you can deliver a positive assessment of yourself. But you find, after going through that cycle for many, many years, through various successes and failures, that actually what's cramping your inner space is not any negative assessment that you might give of yourself, but the fact that you're always assessing. Okay? So that even you realize in retrospect that even in those moments when you felt a certain pride, a certain contentment, a certain self-satisfaction perhaps, right? That there was something kind of superficial about it, and that that space too was rather cramped, rather confined, as if you just weren't allowing the creative energy of life to move through you and to renew and to replenish your soul in the way for which you long, in a way that you might recall from your youth, from your rather early youth, before you started experiencing any significant anxiety about who you were becoming, right? Now, so that kind of bad space, the presence of that, of the oppression that you begin to realize that you live under by realizing the tyranny of that voice, right, is the beginning of yoga, okay? And indeed, for those of you who are conversant with some sort of classical Buddhism, it's also the beginning of the Buddhist path. Because the first noble truth is that experience is pervaded with suffering, right? And Patanjali says in Sutra 215 that all experience, that the wise see, the people of discernment see that all experience is pervaded with suffering, with dukkha, with bad space. Okay. Now the thing about the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism, and it works the same way in the Yoga Sutra, because you actually have all four noble truths in the second pada of the Yoga Sutra. They're all really close to each other too, kind of between 215 and 20, I forget exactly, 25, something like that. You'll see them there. They sketch out a path of contemplation. So they're not just truths that you kind of realize and go, oh, that's true. It's more like they're reality, they're dimensions of experience that you're meant to contemplate very deeply. And you don't even leave those contemplations behind. You just keep going back and back and back so that you see more and more clearly the dimensions of experience in question. Okay? So by contemplating the nature of suffering, discernment, viveka-kyatahi, is sharpened. Okay? It becomes more refined. And for Patanjali, that discernment, viveka-kyatahi, is the engine that drives yoga. Mm-hmm. So far, there's really no, I would say also that between the two approaches to yoga that we're talking about here, there's no difference, right? And also to Buddhism, there's no difference. Mm-hmm. Okay. So that's where it starts, and you'll probably also notice that for most people, mostly, people start yoga around the time of their Saturn return, which is kind of late 20s, early 30s, when, a certain crisis of self-consciousness brings you to this realization that, something is deeply misaligned, right? So Patanjali says, and the tantric approach also says, in a way, that the cause of suffering, and the second noble truth is that there's a cause of suffering. You're meant to contemplate that cause, right? And the cause of suffering, for Patanjali, is a certain kind of ignorance, a certain avidya. Mm-hmm. That consists in mistaking yourself for something that you're not. Okay? Or which consists in, let's say, actually, it's important not to say that it consists in having a false idea of yourself, because having a truthful idea of yourself isn't the solution to this suffering, right? But to identify yourself in some deep sort of visceral way with something that you are not is said to be, for Patanjali, the cause of dukkha, the cause of suffering. Okay? Now, the background metaphysics of the Yoga Sutras is Sankhya. And according to Sankhya, the two most fundamental principles of reality are what's called Prakriti on the one hand and Purusha on the other. And so Prakriti is the matrix of creation. It's the energy and the material and the intelligence out of which the world is formed. Okay? So everything that's in the phenomenal world, everything that's an object of experience or that is part of reality, is part of Prakriti. And so too is everything that's not manifest but could be, right? So all of the sort of infinite creative potentials and the energies that are concealed within those potentials also belong to Prakriti. Okay? So everything that you encounter in your experience, including your own thoughts and emotions and sensations, are part of Prakriti. And Purusha, which just means person, is not. So sort of fundamentally, whatever it is, it's not that. It's not something that can be an object of experience. It's not something that can be an object of thought. It's not something that can be an object of perception. Whatever it is. So you can already see that whatever idea you might try to use to sort of elaborate on this idea of Purusha is going to quickly be swallowed up, right, by the fact that no, Purusha cannot be an object of thought, right? But the basic idea is that it's the sort of background awareness that allows for subject-object experience, like thinking or perceiving or feeling, to come into being. You know? It's the thing that makes experience conscious, whatever that is. And whatever it is, you can't sort of place it before you, right? And sort of take a clear view of it from an impersonal perspective, right? It's always, in some sense, no. It's as if it's always behind you, and because you're sort of entangled in the body, your energy's always flowing out toward the world, toward the realm of Prakriti. And there you find yourself. Or you think you find yourself. There you find all of the various ideas and people and situations that you identify with. And you go, oh, I'm that. I'm this constellation of relationships and thoughts and feelings and emotions and narratives, etc. So Patanjali also says the third noble truth is that this sort of continuous experience of suffering, because that is an experience, can be interrupted. And that's the third noble truth of Buddhism. Right? Future suffering, Patanjali says, is to be avoided. That's how he puts it. Right? So he's saying it can be interrupted. This is possible. And how is it possible? The story that Patanjali is telling is it's possible because Purusha, that foundational awareness, can become disentangled from the realm of Prakriti. And when Purusha is disentangled from Prakriti, Prakriti stops churning. The gunas stop churning. There's a metaphor in the Sankhya Karika of Gaudapada right toward the end where he says that Prakriti dances for the sake of Purusha, which is to say, for the sake of making Purusha self-aware. And when Purusha sees Prakriti, she stops dancing and disappears. Okay? And in the Yoga Sutra, Patanjali says that when consciousness is fully disentangled from the realm of Prakriti, then, right at the beginning of the Yoga Sutras, Tada drastu swarupe vastanam, the seer, Purusha, the seer, abides in its true nature. In what he later calls kaivalyam, aloneness, isolation, total separation from the world. That's how Purusha abides in its own swarupam, its own self-form. Okay? And the world stops spinning for that Purusha. Prakriti stops dancing for that Purusha. Okay? You with me? Okay. So that idea is not this idea that, okay, so first of all, notice that the ultimate destination of yoga, according to Patanjali, is total liberation from the phenomenal world, irremediable detachment. In other words, you escape from the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth once and for all, so that you never have to come back. That's the goal. That's why you signed up, right? That's why you're here? Okay. Now, that's a severe idea, of what yoga practice is all about. It takes sort of austerity to its ultimate conclusion. You know what I mean? Detachment from the world. It's not about on this view. I mean, look, I'm just saying, philosophically and ultimately, what that yoga is about, right, is a kind of disentanglement from the world, a detachment that's so sheer, so complete, right, that nothing that's inside you gets reborn again in this world. The world is utterly transcended. That for you to fully be who you are and to totally escape from the indignity of delusion, you have to completely detach from the world. Right? Now, one thing you might ask, because we didn't talk about this the other day, is what might attract you toward that idea of spirituality? Have you been attracted? I mean, I've been totally attracted to that idea of spirituality before, at certain periods of my life, before I had children and a wife, and because if you took that idea of spirituality on its face value, and look, I understand there are other ways of understanding sort of what that means. That you could say that there's a certain, a sense in which through that act of total surrender, you arrive again in the present moment so fully and so completely, that your experience is utterly refreshed. But what I'm saying is consider that that's not, I mean, take a more sort of literal rendering, of this approach to spirituality, which, because by the way, that idea of spirituality is not confined to the Yoga Sutras, especially at the time. I mean, it had been, in the ancient world for many centuries before Patanjali wrote, which was probably 2, 3, 400 years after the beginning of the current era. But you can go as far back as Plato, so 300 or 400 years in the opposite direction, and you have the same idea that ultimately, spiritual life is about escaping the cycle of rebirth, right? But what I think is most interesting for us as practitioners is not to sort of understand sort of, historically I mean, it is extremely interesting. I'm not trying to deflect the question, but sort of like what attracted people at that time to that particular idea of spirituality, without reinterpreting it. Okay? But another question is, what sort of attracts us to that idea of spirituality? If we are attracted to it, and if we're not, Why not? I think asking yourself that question is very constructive. Yeah. And so I invite you just to do that, to ask yourself that question. But, Plato had this idea that, that somehow didn't really work its way into sort of popular psychology, although Freud made a lot of it. But he had this idea that one of the parts of the soul is called Thanatos, the death instinct, right? The instinct toward dissolution, right? And of course, in yoga, in Hatha yoga, we have a certain force that we work with, quite conspicuously called apana, the dissolving force, the force behind the exhale, right? The force that flushes excess material from the body and the mind, but also the force that sort of dissolves worlds and so forth, apana. And you might think of Thanatos, the death instinct, as a kind of, a sort of a Greek variation of that same idea. And the thought is that force is inside of us, and it's part of the intelligence of life, right? And just as birth is part of life, the release of death is part of life, and the energies both then of creation and sustenance and continuous reorganization, as well as dissolution, which has to be in play for there to be reorganization, are fundamental energies of life, right? And that there's something inside these bodies, some mechanism inside these bodies that knows how to die, that knows how to age, right? It's not as if aging is a process of being attacked from the outside, right? I think the body ages from the inside, right? The cells just start behaving differently at a certain, over time. I mean, actually they behave differently throughout different phases of life, and that's just part of the process of being alive. But that sort of dissolving force, that dissolution, right, is also felt. It is, well, first of all, it should be said that force is essential to the, essential to the yogic process itself. Right? So we've been talking at length over these past 2 weeks about how essential it is to work with apana for anything interesting to happen in asana, psychologically and energetically. Right? And indeed, it's as if that sort of impulse to let things go and to surrender, and the impulse that things themselves have to dissolve somehow, right, is essential to the possibility of the movement of life, right? Because otherwise things would stagnate to such a point that life itself wouldn't be possible, right? And there can be also in the heart something that can be felt as part of the spiritual longing, Let's say if whatever that spiritual longing is, it can certainly take the form of wanting to be closer to have deeper communion with the creative source of one's being. Wanting communion with something that's fundamental to reality itself. And then the spiritual longing can take the form of wanting to sort of plunge oneself into the abyssal source, perhaps irremediably, right? just like falling in love and wanting to sort of dissolve oneself into the space of intimacy that one shares with the beloved. Right? To dive like a moth into the eternal flame of spirit and to be totally scorched. It's familiar, right? The spiritual impulse can take that form of wanting to follow the death instinct to its logical conclusion. Do you see what I mean? Of wanting to be fully, irremediably liberated from the confinement of an egocentric mind, right? And released of form completely. Mm. Okay. So that's kind of the first approach, right? But there are other approaches that follow Kama, or follow Kama's Greek cousin, Eros. Both of whom are archers, both of who represent desire. Whereas in the first approach, desire is mostly something to distance oneself from. And so in that way, something probably to be mostly distrusted when the desire is drawing you toward further attachment in worldly life. You know what I mean? Drawing you into real relationships where there's some emotional risk, a mutual emotional risk involved, right? That on the first approach, that would be something to distrust. And you might ask yourself, what your relationships with the people that you love might be like if you looked upon the emotional risk that you take in loving them as something to be transcended and overcome. If you're an ascetic and your sort of fundamental concern is liberation from the world of form, there's no problem. Okay, so this is not a conceptual or a logical problem. It's just a problem of, coming up against two sort of different orientations to life. And you might even say two different modes of being, two different ways of being in the world, right? One in which the practice of detachment, which is important in any yoga, right? Because following the instinct to come unraveled is important to yoga as such. It doesn't just belong to this first approach, right? But in the first approach, that instinct to let things unravel is sort of the guiding light, The fundamental is that you follow Thanatos, you follow the death instinct rather than following Kama or following Eros. Right? In Tantric yoga, there's much is made of the idea of following Kama. Because desire is looked upon something not that is sort of ultimately misleading, and that will ultimately just draw you further into the delusion of samsara. Because the second approach, you might say, is, which also holds, as the classical yoga does, that the cause of suffering is false identification. The second approach also says that the cause of suffering is a false identification, or is identification of the self with something that it's not, let's say. You can put it that way. But there's a very different perspective, a different valuation put on desire. Because desire is seen in a very different light. Okay? So now, instead of, even though the Sankhya philosophy stands in the background here, there's a different point of emphasis. Okay? And, just for the sake of sort of using very broad brushes, just painting out these two pictures and looking at least one fundamental difference between them, because that's what we're doing here, is to say that in this tantric approach, the Shiva Shakti approach, this approach that we've been exploring by contemplating these mythological stories that are, after all, about the love affairs between Shiva and Shakti, or between consciousness and creative power, which are the sort of which in many ways echo the distinction between Purusha and Prakriti, but with some profoundly important differences. The idea here is that consciousness, which has these two aspects, let's say, of spatiality and creativity. That should remind you of something we've been working with a lot in the context of alignment. Consciousness has inside of it, as part of its creative dynamism, as part of the Shakti part, this deep desire for self-expression. And a deep desire, and that desire for self-expression is also a desire to unfold inherent creative possibilities into the space of awareness. In other words, Shakti has as her fundamental desire to reveal herself in the space of awareness, the space that's symbolized by the figure of Shiva. Her fundamental desire is to engage in the kind of intimacy that consists in revealing her sensual side and having that side be fully, completely received. To have it be experienced, to have it be touched and tasted and smelled, and etc. And she wants to do that because this profundity of consciousness, of which Shiva and Shakti are just two inseparable dimensions, right, is simply disposed to unfold its creative power and to revel in the immediate awareness of its inherent potential. Are you with me? And the idea is that's the cosmology, that's the background picture of what reality is. Consciousness contemplating the spontaneous unfoldment of its own sensuous aspect. And it's said, right, in alignment with the older Sankhya philosophy, that sensuous aspect is infinite, that it can reveal, Shakti can reveal infinite sides of herself. Really? Remember the figure of Ananta Shesha, who represents unmanifest Prakriti, and Ananta means without end, right? The Shesha, what's left out of the ritual, goes on without end, which is to say that what's not manifest and what's not seen is itself infinite, which means that what has the potential to be expressed, to be shown, and so to unfold itself in the space of awareness is endless, which is to say Shakti's never fully seen. She's just always in the process of revealing a new side of herself, something that's never been seen before, a new being in all of its uniqueness, right? And because those are the energies that shape us, we see and appreciate, you know, that dimension of other sentient beings, their uniqueness, their, right? The fact that each sentient being is, I'm kind of going to echo Hannah Arendt here, that she didn't say it exactly like this, but that sentient beings are all the same and that each one is different from all the others. Right? And we know that, and when Arendt was saying that, she was pointing out as something that conditions, moral sanity. Like, to understand that, to lose sight of that is to lose your humanity completely, right? To start to think that, for example, individual human beings can be replaced, that are replaceable, right? Expendable, so that you could expend some and then just make more, and that would be okay, that you would have somehow, right, filled the gap. That's insane, right? That's abominable, that's monstrous thinking, right? Thinking that's totally lost touch with the human heart, right? Because the longings of the human heart are just splinters of the longing of Shakti, okay? So our most fundamental desire also, right, is to reveal our creative potentials into the space of awareness and to have that seen, acknowledged, recognized. Right? So the idea is that Shakti kind of, splinters herself, and then, because Shiva's adoring gaze is always going wherever she goes, consciousness gets splintered in a certain way or in a certain field. There's another field in which it's never splintered, fine enough. But in a certain field, it gets splintered and kind of localized at an individual body, right? The profundity splinters itself into the forms of all of these individual embodied beings precisely to contemplate itself from as many different perspectives. And so the self-contemplation of reality is taking place through our minds and senses, through our bodies, through our relationships, right? And we, as participants in that process, are only very dimly aware of that fact, is the idea, okay? And then, here's the real point of distinction now with the Patanjali Yoga Sutra is that liberation consists in waking up to the reality of what's actually happening and then embracing it with the whole heart. You see what I mean? And so it's the sort of opening of the opening of your consciousness to whatever's actually arising or to the creative energy of life insofar as it moves through the space of your embodied experience and through the relationships that you have with others is the focus of the second approach to yoga. You see what I mean? And that would orient you very differently, would it not? Not to say if you were liberated, I just mean as a practitioner with a certain idea of what it is that you're doing, that second idea is going to orient you very differently toward the affairs of the heart, right? And toward relationships with other beings than the first approach, isn't it? Don't you think? Okay. So, is that a raised hand? Yeah, yeah. No. You don't want to be on the camera? So, these stories, these Shiva and Shakti stories, are stories of love. But they're also stories of spiritual awakening at the same time, because the point is that the field of relationship, the field of desire, right, is the space within which spiritual development unfolds. Whereas on the previous approach, right, it's about disentangling from this sphere, not embracing it. I mean, to put it shortly, to put it simply, of course, there are many qualifications to be made, but we set it aside. Okay. So when we left off last time, Shiva's first romantic relationship, let's say first, not really first because he doesn't really have any, first in this story, right, was with Sati. And Sati was kind of Shiva's gothic teenage girlfriend. Super fiery, probably wore a Black Flag t-shirt, combat boots, the whole thing. She'd bite people sometimes, probably, I don't know. And their relationship was super hot and fiery and short. And it ended with her throwing herself onto her father's sacrificial fire. So we already talked about the kind of the significance of all of that. Because she had sort of fulfilled this promise to withdraw from the world if the other gods didn't recognize her sublime nature, right? Now, maybe it's worth saying here, to recognize her sublime nature would just be to recognize that she is, as we must recognize each other, right? An emanation of an infinite creative potential that's always in the process of becoming something else. So when we see each other through the reductive lens of our ideas, and when we, more importantly, reduce each other to those ideas and lose sight of our divine, our infinite nature, okay, then we don't see each other at all. What we see is really only an empty shell. And it's that empty shell that Sati left behind when she threw herself into the fire. Okay. And so I'm going to go I'm going to sort of jump forward a bit more than, so that we can focus a little bit more on a sort of bigger picture view of this mythological story. So I'm going to skip some pieces, and I'm going to tell some pieces much faster than maybe, than we might do otherwise, so that we can see what the overall development, what the arc is of Shiva's kind of unfolding consciousness, or the unfolding consciousness of the protagonist of this particular story, which isn't really Shiva, it's just a reflection, But this protagonist goes through a period of intense grief. Okay? Shiva goes through a period of intense grief after Sati throws herself in the fire. And he eventually withdraws completely from the world. And he goes back up into his cave and he meditates again in the same way that he was meditating, before Sati incarnated, in order to, precisely for the sake of pulling him out of his solitary meditation back into creative involvement with the world, right? And as I pointed out, and it's easy to point it out right here again, so I'll do it again. You might hear an implicit criticism, right, of at least one way of understanding the classical approach to yoga in the very idea that when Shiva goes off to meditate alone, in abstraction from Shakti, the world goes out of balance. Right? The Asuras start tyrannizing the Devas, and the world doesn't come back into balance until Shiva's pulled out of himself, right? Out of his self-absorption in a way, back into creative involvement with the world, right? And by the way, it's the mere fact of him being back into creative involvement with the world that usually brings it back into balance. Shiva never goes out and sort of, fights as a mercenary on the side of the Devas. That never happens. Because in fact, and this is super important, he doesn't care who's gaining the upper hand between the Devas and the Asuras. Because whatever Shiva is, he's not a champion for good over evil. Okay? Because he's the background aware. I mean, psychologically, he's the background of awareness that holds space for that whole dynamic, for the whole drama of, the war between the parts of yourself that you're anxious to identify with, the Devas, and the parts of yourself that you're anxious to dissociate from, the Asuras, right? And there's nothing that he does to try to make sure that the Devas gain the upper hand. Right? He just holds space for all of the drama of Prakriti, all of the drama of Shakti to unfold, and he delights in all of it, no matter what's happening. Unless he succumbs to his own centripetal force and he's in that sort of state of kaivalyam, of isolation from the world, and then everything gets messy. A way of understanding that, because I don't remember if we talked about that the other day, is that unless you bring awareness to your karmic situation, unless you bring awareness to your conditioning, unless you bring awareness to what is calling out for your attention in your subconscious mind, it will, as Carl Jung said, come back to run your life. Because it will keep drawing you into different circumstances and situations that force you with ever greater kind of intensity and urgency to bring awareness to the parts of yourself that you're hiding from yourself. Just turns out it works that way. Don't take anyone's word for it. Just reflect. You've probably already realized that, right? And you can also understand that in reference again to this kind of cosmological idea that Shakti's ultimate desire is to be seen. And so anything that any part of her that sort of condenses into the phenomenal world, into your embodied experience, that you don't allow to come to the surface of your consciousness, just stays there waiting to ripen, just waiting for the moment when you're vulnerable enough, open enough, receptive enough, or maybe just exhausted enough to pay attention and allow it to be seen, to be experienced, to be embodied. And that's the idea, is that that's all it really wants. And the dimension of it that seems sinister and threatening is mostly owes to the fact that you've backed it into a corner and that you're resisting it. So if it seems like it has sharp teeth and claws, it's probably because you're holding the pitchfork at it, so to speak, right? Hmm. And so that idea, like in the epic poetry, in the Ramayana, for example, remember that whenever a demon is slayed, it usually immediately reveals itself to be some perfectly lovely being who had somehow, had a curse put on it. So it was like, oh, it was just inherently evil. It was and then you kill it and it's gone. That's not the dynamic. That's not how it plays out in Indian mythology. Usually, it's like instead you slay it and then it reveals itself to be something very different than it seemed to be, something far more relatable. Right? Okay. So, if you don't turn your attention toward the space of your embodiment, toward where you can have an immediate encounter with your karmic situation, an immediate encounter with your samskaras, an immediate encounter with your conditioning, things will probably go out of balance in the sphere of your conscious life, right? And you might think it's something else. You see what I mean? And so that's kind of the idea. One way to understand what's symbolized by the fact that whenever Shiva goes off to meditate alone, the worlds go out of balance. Okay? So Shiva goes off to meditate alone again. Why? Because he can't process this loss. His grief is so... It's not the grief... There's no suggestion here that grief is a problem. It's not, right? Grief can be thought of as an act of honoring the loss of something loved, right? And as an essential movement of the psyche, as it, surrenders attachment necessarily, to something that no longer is, right? But because this is a fine, good yarn, Shiva doesn't grieve properly. Even Shiva, he doesn't. Instead he withdraws from everybody, even from his ganas. And he just goes wandering, alone. And he won't talk to anybody. And his devotees don't even recognize him. He goes and begging out in front of his own temples in the story. And they've got, these wonderful dishes of prasad, of offerings that they're going to make inside the Shiva temple to Shiva. But he's so emaciated and so undignified, wallowing, in his loss, that they don't even recognize him, so they step right over him. Get out of the way, you beggar, and they go inside with their... So it's like that. So finally he just goes up into the mountains and he makes himself numb with meditation. You ever do that? You have? Reminding us again of the ways that yoga can be an escape from life, right? And I hope you don't take this the wrong way. You have to listen closely to what I'm saying, not because it's complicated, but because it's easy to mistake what I'm saying. That one common attraction, probably, to that first approach to yoga is a desire to escape from what's thorny and difficult about life, right? To what really makes you vulnerable, to what's really threatening. What's most threatening? What makes you most vulnerable? Falling in love. Loving other people. Because the people you love are the people who can really hurt you. Nobody else can. You can chop off your fingers and toes, but that's nothing, compared to what your lovers can do without even touching you. Okay? So it's when you fall in love that you're truly opened and exposed, And I'm not saying, I'm not saying that that's what Patanjali Yoga is all about. I don't believe that for a second. I'm just saying that one attraction of an ordinary person spirituality of that kind, like, oh yeah, I'm into that. I want to, disengage from the world of relationship, and I don't want a job anymore, and I don't want, to talk to my family because they're awful, and all my friends are awful, and, all I want to do is read Advaita and meditate and smoke pot, okay? Leave me alone. Not that I would know. I'm just imagining different scenarios here, okay? Um, but this is exactly what Shiva does in this story, which is so incredible. Like, what a good story, because so he goes and he does that, right? And so then the worlds go out of balance. And so then a certain demon named Taraka starts to tyrannize the Devas once again. Well, after being granted a boon by Brahma, according to which he can't be killed except by a son of Shiva, which he thought was super clever because Shiva didn't have any sons, and he's not exactly father material, so kind of and he doesn't even spill his seed in front of the goddess, so he thought, like, because they always want the same thing when they get their boons, they always ask Brahma for immortality, and he always says, I can't do that, it's like cosmic law or something. Can't grant them immortality because nobody has immortality because of him. Remember I told you that when he first woke up on that pericarp of that lotus flower that sprouted out of Vishnu's navel, and he said, who the hell, who am I? What has happened? And then his first thought was of death. And then there's Yama on the horizon. And then he brought another bunch of other beings into existence, and they're all like, you mean he got here first? Because it means they're all immortal, or they're all mortal now. And he was never forgiven for that by his sons. Okay. So Taraka is, tyrannizing the Devas, so they have to go and ask the goddess if she'll incarnate again and pull Shiva out of his meditative stupor again. So she agrees, and she's born into the world as Parvati, the daughter of the mountain, it means. Okay? And her father is the mighty mountain Himavat. And he's a devotee of the goddess. So this is a much more auspicious circumstance than the previous one where Sati's father was Daksha. So anyways, Parvati, much like Sati does, from a very early age, starts to have dreams of Shiva. And she starts, just like Sati had done, to draw pictures of Shiva. Right? But her father, Parvati's father, is quite pleased, unlike Daksha. So he kind of, oh, amazing, So he gives her more art supplies, I guess, finer things to draw with. And then when as she matures, she starts to do bhakti rituals, much as Sati had done before. And she also has a period of fairly intense bhakti. So she goes through this fairly intense period of bhakti ritual in which she's kind of she's chanting Shiva's name, and she's kind of drawing him closer and closer to her, she thinks. Right? And then there's a moment when Shiva's sort of wakes up, from his meditation, and for reasons that he can't articulate to himself, he gets up and he moves and he goes, up to, toward these other reaches of the mountains, and it just so happens that he's being drawn. He doesn't know this, but he's being drawn by her devotion toward the kingdom of Himavan, toward Himavat's kingdom, yeah? And he goes up into the mountains there and finds another cave and sits down to meditate. Right? And there's nobody else around but his vehicle, his white bull. So it's just him and Nandan up there. And Parvati, who's now a young lady, sets out to go up the mountain because she's been alerted to the presence, of what. So nobody else in the kingdom except for her, she and her father understand that Shiva has come up to the mountaintop. So he goes up there. Somebody from the kingdom, sees that there's some sadhu in a cave and goes back and reports to the king. And he says, um, he's kind of been expecting this because of some palmistry that was done by a certain rishi to Parvati when she was young. Okay, so then he's expecting Shiva to appear, and she's expecting Shiva to appear because the rishi told her that this was going to happen and also gave her the 5-syllable Shiva mantra to sort of prepare for meeting him. Okay, so the king orders everybody else to stay away and just tells the kingdom that a certain rishi has come to perform some rituals for the sake of the kingdom, and he's not to be disturbed. So he orders everybody to stay away, and then gives a little wink to Parvati. So the next day she goes up there, and she brings some offerings, and she dresses to the nines, as they say, and she goes up the mountain, and she's going up toward these, snowy glaciated peaks, right? And as she's walking, the snow line just keeps retreating, as it sometimes seems to do in the mountains. But more extraordinarily, the higher she walks, the mountains just get greener and greener, more lush, more fertile, as if she's walking down in a mountain valley in the springtime, right? And she never quite gets to the snow line, but all this, snow melt is coming down, and these gorgeous rivulets, and the honeybees are swarming around, and the cuckoos are flying, and little fawns are jumping about. And it's like, what is happening? It's like November. I don't know what. So she's going up and up the mountain, and as if this wave of springtime is following her. Yeah? And she goes all the way to the mouth of the cave. She sees Nandan there, and Nandan opens one of his big bovine eyes and sees her and snorts and closes, obviously undisturbed at her presence. So she kind of wends her way past him and goes into the cave, and there's Shiva. Yeah. And so this is the first time she's seen him in this incarnation as Parvati. And of course, she doesn't even remember her past life necessarily, right? At this point, she doesn't even really know who she is. She just knows that Shiva's been haunting her dreams for as long as she can remember, and that she feels this sort of deep devotional longing to be near him, to know him, to see him. And so she comes into the cave, and she sits down in front of him and closes her eyes, and with no formal instruction in meditation, she just moves right into the abyss of consciousness, into the space of Shiva, and she feels herself just sinking down, 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 sinking very, very deeply into this space. And she doesn't really know which way she's going, which way's up, which way's down, but she feels this sort of inward drawing, this Jeshta current drawing her in and in and in. And she goes further and further until she finally sees a little white light. And so then she starts kind of steering herself with attention toward that white light, moving closer and closer. And just as the snow line had retreated up the mountain, so this white light is moving further and further away as she approaches. So she kind of just like move a little bit faster, and it retreats and retreats. But she sees it stop sometimes and let her get a little bit closer and then go back. So she can tell that it's like It's messing, something's playing with her, So she gets closer and closer, and then sometimes this light, it kind of flips. So the light, of course, is Shiva, and he's like, who is this deep into my space? And he feels this kind of feminine presence moving toward him, and he doesn't want any part of it because he's still licking his wounds. He's still in the whole, like, I just got out of a really hard relationship. And so as she's coming before him, he's kind of waiting and waiting. And then he starts to kind of flare up with his tapas, to send a wave of heat her way, to tell her to stay back like this. But she's the goddess, so she's undeterred. Yeah? She just keeps moving toward the light. And finally, Shiva really gives her a blast of heat. And so Parvati, there in the mouth of the cave, is just sitting there, sweat dripping down her, all the way down from her forehead, but she's just fully withstanding, with full ease, this the presence of Shiva's intense tapas. And Shiva can't believe it because no one can withstand the presence of his tapas, as far as he can remember. At least nobody that's around anymore. And then he feels a quiver in his heart. And so he opens his eyes and he sees this beautiful young woman sitting before him. And just over her shoulder is an archer with an arrow drawn. Okay? And he releases the arrow, and Shiva lets a blast of tapas out of his third eye of heat and scorches the arrow and the archer in a single stroke before the arrow hits his heart. And then Parvati, who just suddenly feels this sort of hot flash over her shoulder, hears a scream outside and turns around and sees this big heap of ashes and the continuation of this hysterical screaming. And she looks at Shiva, and Shiva quickly closes his eyes and sucks back into himself. And so she doesn't bother following him. She just gets up and she goes home. Fair enough. It got weird, So she comes back the next day, and she's not surprised to find that he's gone. Didn't even wait for her. He's gone. So she sets down her offering. She sweeps out the mouth of the cave. She lights the fire again. She goes home. She returns, every day, and he's never there. And she understands he's not coming back. And she also understands that, as the Rishi told her, that she would have to prepare herself very intensely to meet Shiva. And she thought it was just like this bhakti ritual thing. But now she understands that the real penance hasn't even begun. Okay? So she goes out, she leaves her father's home, and she goes out and she does the most intense and austere devotional penance that the world had ever seen, that ever been done in Devaloka. And it takes 3 years, and she sits between 3 fires in the middle of the summer. She sits in water up to her neck in the springtime. She lets the snow fall all over her in the winter. She wears only bark. At first, I don't know, she eats berries and leaves at first, and then only bark, and then nothing the 3rd year. Super intense, She has to go through this big thing, to get him back. To get him to pay attention again to her and to recognize her, which, of course, he eventually does, right? But it takes years of her doing this penance and so forth. And finally he comes back he comes in the form of just looking like an old sadhu, and she doesn't even recognize him at first. And he comes and kind of plays a little trick on her. He's kind of trying to like feel her out and see, like, I mean, can you imagine? Kind of asking her what she's up to, just trying to kind of befriend her and so on and so forth. And when she finally intimates to this old sadhu that she thinks that she's doing all of this penance for Shiva, he cackles loudly and tries to tell her that that Shiva, is vile, and that and that this she, being this sort of beautiful, well-bred, noble being, uh, has that it's totally beneath her, to be around Shiva. And she orders him away, and just as she orders him away, he changes his form and sort of flashes his face and shows her that he's Shiva. But she turns away and pretends not to notice, because she's better at this stuff than he is, and and says, "I'll show you, old sadhu. Shiva will event," because he's saying, "Oh, is he like, and what kind of lover would allow you to put yourself through these life-threatening austerities for 3 years, and never come back and sort of show himself?" And he says, "You'll see, Shiva will he will appear, and when he does, he's going to go ask my parents, my father, for my hand in marriage formally," which means, of course, that they're going to have a traditional Indian wedding. And Shiva, remember, is anything but ceremonious, right? He's kind of like, up to this point, he takes no part in ritual. Right? He's not into it at all. He prefers to stay out on the margins of society with beings that, don't even really have any social skills. The ganas, they don't really even, the sort of conventions of relating don't even make sense to them. And these are the beings that Shiva prefers to be around, because he prefers these relationships that are unmediated by convention, and by ritual, and etc. Okay, so this happens, and Shiva sends an emissary of celestial beings to go ask for Parvati's hand in marriage, and her parents accept, and still lots of story. We're skipping fast here, but they get married, okay? And then they go off and on their honeymoon, just like the honeymoon time with Sati, they go and they make love, for 25 divine years. And the only thing that brings it to a close, because remember, as I told you, their erotic entanglement is the fundamental metaphor for Hatha Yoga, okay? The process of Hatha Yoga, in its mythological description, in most of the Hatha texts that is described as a process of awakening a vital energy, right, that resides either in the pelvis or the heart or somewhere in the lower reaches of the body, and having it rise up through the hollow center of the body, burning through different entanglements of conditioning, and that's Shakti, and eventually uniting with Shiva in the cranial vault. And then when in that moment of union, which is the moment of the non-dual insight, something rains back down. And the mountain in Hatha Yoga, in the twilight language of Hatha Yoga, the mountain is a sort of metaphor for the central supporting member of the body, right? Of the spine, or the center of the mountain would be Sushumna Nadi. Right? And the honeymooning always happens at the top of the mountain. With Shiva and Sati, they go up to Shiva's mountaintop abode, and that's where they explore the sensual aspect of the feminine principle. And so it is with Shiva and Parvati, right? But whereas Sati had a very fiery nature, and whereas their relationship was very short-lived, I was telling you this yesterday, right? That Parvati is much more aligned with earth and water. And she's, of course, she's as fierce can be, but she's also into the whole homemaking thing. Okay? And so that's what she does, and that's the kind of relationship they have, and it's very stable, and that it continues on, and they even have children. Not by ordinary means, but by, supernatural technologies. So, one of the things that we mentioned last time that you wanted to hear a little bit more about was this idea of the dark night of the soul, or this idea of a moment in spiritual life where one's had a sense of being intimate with the creative source of one's being. One's had a sense of deep communion with the divine, of deep communion with God. And one's been, really touched by that and elevated by that, transformed by that. And one goes forth with a certain idea about what happened. And then one perhaps even looks for the continuation of that idea as the continuation of one's spiritual unfoldment. And one finds that one's fantasy about the continuation of that movement is interrupted by reality. In that the divine, in the form that one had imagined, doesn't reappear. Right? And so that expression, the dark night of the soul, comes from the writing of St. John of the Cross, who is describing precisely this. A period of feeling intense communion with God, followed by a sort of experience of spiritual barrenness, of estrangement from God, that according to him was the most excruciating, most painful experience of his life, right? That eventually came to a close, but not in the form of the original image of God reappearing, right? But in the form of a kind of ripening insight into the nature of the divine, and a realization of the trick that his mind was playing on him by projecting a particular image of God and supposing that somehow God was going to happily conform to that. You see what I mean? And he says that, when the experience of communion then with God returns, the experience itself took a radically different form. In which it's not as even that God came with a new face, but God came with no face at all. And that's what this book, The Dark Night of the Soul, is about. And extraordinarily, I think, that's what this myth is retelling, that same basic movement in spiritual life, okay? Because So when Shiva was in that cave and he felt a quiver in his heart, what had happened was Kama came and shot him. That was Kama. And Kama had been put up to the task by Indra, who was kind of like, hey, this meeting between Parvati and Shiva is about to happen. I really need it to go well. Can you be there and, make sure it's like dirty government work, make sure this thing goes down the way we need it to go down, And he's like, oh yeah, I can do this, right? So he shoots Shiva in the heart with one arrow. He opens his eyes. He sees this, and what happens when Kama shoots you with an arrow? If he has 5 arrows, and they're all tipped with different floral essences that are specific to the individual senses. And so if he shoots you with an arrow that has the floral essence that's specific to the sense of sight, then the first being that you see, you fall in love with. Okay? If he shoots you with the one that's specific to the sense of hearing, then you fall in love with the next one you hear, and etc. Okay? So he opens his eyes and sees this beautiful young woman there, right? And he's already been shot, and is like, and so like he feels this kind of swell of desire. And then he incinerates Kama on the spot. And the incineration of Kama doesn't kill Kama, actually. I mean, his body's reduced to ashes, but he pervades the atmosphere. Okay? And remember, this is happening up in the mountains. Parvati and Shiva are meeting up in the mountains while this is happening. Right? And so Kama sort of pervades the atmosphere of consciousness through this. Once it's like Shiva releases him from his form. Okay? So that he's kind of incarnate. But also what the burning of Kama represents also is Shiva's release, the dissolution of his attachment to a particular image of his beloved. That is the image of Sati, the former incarnation of Shakti, right? Because his grieving wasn't helping him move past the ending of that relationship, right? Precisely because he was it's like his heart had contracted and he wasn't willing to recognize the possibility that he could love again because he had reduced the beloved, his whole idea of the beloved, to a particular image of what she was. He had reduced God to a particular image and then expected the continuation of that intimacy to take the form of communion with that same character, with that same image, with that same vision, that same experience, right? And, St. John of the Cross says that he knows that God withdrew from him in that image precisely to show him, so that his sense of who God was could deepen and ripen and become more profound. In other words, to show him that he can't be reduced to any particular image, right? And remember, Sati said, basically, if anybody reduces me to an image, I'm out of there, right? And so she did. She withdrew. And then Shiva goes through his dark night of the soul. And then Parvati reappears in another form. And Shiva can't recognize Parvati as his beloved and accept her as his beloved and fall in love with her and accept her and recognize that she is even the next incarnation of his beloved until he burns that idol. And that's the burning of Kama, the burning of that individual desire as attachment to a particular image of the beloved, so that the beloved can stand forth as something entirely new, as something entirely different than who he thought she was. You see what I mean? And so it's because Shiva now doesn't reduce Parvati to a particular image of who she is, that their relationship goes on and on and on. It doesn't have some nasty, they don't have a nasty breakup story. They have some close calls. They have some, taking space from each other and stuff like that. Big fights too, awesome fights. But, that's the stuff of love. And so part of what is represented by the relation between Shiva and Parvati is the stabilization of that experience of communion with the divine and the integration of insight into its presence, of awareness of its presence, if you like, the recognition of the immanence of the divine in ordinary life. That's why Shiva and Parvati have this very, they have children and stuff there. Probably don't go to parent-teacher conferences or anything like that, but still, it's a big, it's a like next phase of life kind of thing. And his acceptance of the formal wedding ceremony can be seen as an acceptance that an acceptance of the phenomenal realm that's founded on the insight that there's nowhere else to love. That whatever the goddess might be in her incarnate form, it's unapproachable. And that to love the emanation, to love, one must love the emanation, the embodiment of the goddess, and that's right here in the phenomenal world. You see what I mean? And so that's this, what we're calling the tantric rather than the classical approach to yoga. The re-embracing of the ordinary world under the recognition that it's entirely extraordinary, right? That it's sort of saturated with enchantment. And so he even accepts the sort of, and so he comes down the mountain to meet Parvati, and immerses himself fully in the samsaric, ceremonious, highly ritualized, formalized wedding ceremony, right? That symbolizes the re-embracing of ordinary life, or then that symbolizes the integration of the experience of Hatha Yoga, the experience of consciousness fully opening to the spontaneous spreading and unfoldment of creative energy, which is the fundamental, the interpenetration of the masculine and feminine principles as signified by the Shiva Lingam, is what the process of Hatha Yoga is. And then the nectar rains back down, right? And the nectar raining back down represents the descent of grace and also the reintegration of the non-dual insight back into ordinary experience. So now Shiva, when Parvati and Shiva come back down the mountain, remember when Sati came back down the mountain after the erotic tryst of Shiva and Shakti, after the experience of Hatha Yoga. She carved a path of destruction. That was like a Kundalini experience that's not integrated back into ordinary life, right? One that leaves you with the sense that the divine is elsewhere. You had this experience, now you form an image of what God is like, but it's not here. This isn't it. I'm estranged from, I need to get back to that, whatever is behind all of this, right? But with Shiva and Parvati, it's totally different. They go up the mountain, they have their honeymoon, they come back down and visit their parents. Well, her parents. He doesn't have parents. You see what I mean? And so one more sort of interpretive turn is, and I started mentioning this, but it can't be said too many times. Now this is the part where we're talking about how energy moves through the body and so forth, that that nectar that rains down in the traditional metaphor of Hatha Yoga is, said to be in the Hatha text. Like, how does it get there? What is it? And I was telling you the other day, they say it's the sublimated form of sexual fluid. So you have to raise it up into the head somehow. Okay? And if you take that literally, you've got problems, okay? Instead, you're going to cause problems. It's a metaphor for the rarefication of the vital force, of the erotic energy, of the force of desire, of the force that makes the world turn, of Shakti's desire to unfold herself in the space of consciousness, which takes the form of your own vital energy. So your desire to live, the desire of the body to live, regardless of what your mind may sometimes protest against that, right? But the body might have its own ideas about how long you're going to be in this particular form. And that desire, Shakti's desire, we'd said is also the longing, our longing to experience the world, to experience the sensual aspect of reality, right? To be here and to see what there is to see, to know other minds, right? To live, to watch, and to thrive, to learn things, to develop, to discover our creative potentials, to watch other beings grow, to contemplate the movement of creative energy in life. And in ordinary consciousness, because we keep forming particular ideas of what life is like and of what we are and of what an acceptable continuation of experience is supposed to look like, we keep resisting the actual flow of experience. There's something in our hearts that longs for a deeper communion with the creative source, or, to refer back to the previous description, that longs to sort of wake up and realize our participation in this process of consciousness contemplating itself. That's a deep longing in the heart. But we keep projecting a particular idea of what that's going to look like and what we're going to be like, when we progress in yoga and spirituality. Or when God finally comes to us, what her dress is going to look like, right? How she's going to hold us, etc., right? And it's only in the surrendering of those images, the burning of kama, which is the release of the energy of desire from its particular form, from the particular form that it takes when we're grasping at particular images of what the continuation and fulfillment of our experience is going to be like. When we release those images, then the energy of desire is allowed to pervade the space of consciousness, just like it does when Shiva burns Kama, so that we can recognize the beloved as it actually is, so that we can meet reality as it actually is, so that we can receive the energy of love, the energy of the erotic energy that makes the world turn. Just not, don't confuse erotic with sexual. It just means of the nature of Eros, of the nature of desire, of the nature of love. And it can take many, many, many forms. In the form that it takes when it releases its object so that it's no longer making us grasp at particular images or circumstances or relationships, but just gives us a perfect and complete openness to the movement of creative energy, is an open heart. Just a total open, embracing mode of being, to which you might feel that then the energy pours back down, the energy of longing, the energy of desire, when it's released into the atmosphere of consciousness, is allowed to bloom and then circulate back into the heart, so that it makes the subtle body light up with new creative vitality, giving us the experience of being fully refreshed and renewed, right? As if being reborn again into the into the present moment, right? And perhaps finding that you brought certain memories and experiences with you, and certain realities and responsibilities to others, and feeling so grateful for that, right? That it was that you didn't grasp at it at all, but it was simply given to you yet again, another day, to play this role, to live this life, to allow this karmic situation to unfold. And so what comes back down as the descent of grace is just the erotic energy, the energy of desire, which is Shakti, being released from its object and coming back into the space of consciousness as pure selfless love. Om Karam Bindu Samyaktam Nityam Dayanti Yoginaha Kamadam Mokshadam Chaiva Om Karaya Namo Namaha. Oh. That's that. Thank you.